It's interesting, though, to conflate together UFOs and craft, or literally things in the sky, and then like angels, fairies, that sort of world. From more of a shamanic perspective, I think they would be more blended. It'd be like the universe is just completely alive all around us in all sorts of different dimensions of all different shapes and sizes and motivations. The plant life, the plant spirits, the underworlds, the inner life, and then extra dimensional beings, other planets. Just looking at our own planet and how much life there is here, just almost infinite little bits from microbes and viruses all the way up to mammals. Why wouldn't it be like that?
Hey, welcome back to the transmission, my friends. Hope you're excellent. I have been just blasting my neurons with a lot of mind-altering reality quakers as of late, the kind of content that really makes you question the nature of self and what's going on here in a meta sense. But I feel like I say this at the beginning of every podcast, but I think it is particularly true this week between the video I just put out on the as above, so below concept, the incredibly deep work of the brilliant Richard Tarnas, who's going to be in the Mind Meld soon, the mythopoetic masterpiece that is the Emerald podcast, because I'm going to have the creator of that show, Josh Schrey, in the Mind Meld this week, and also the sonic emanations, the music of the man in this Mind Meld, East Forest. It is quite a potent concoction of pulsating, living mystery and like sacred longing. But anyway, I shall attempt to narrow that nebulous emotion and aim it back into the man of this Mind Meld, East Forest, which actually is not very hard to do, because in a sense his music is a sonic permutation of that exact thing that I just described. If you haven't ever had the pleasure of listening to East Forest, it is just heart-opening, beautiful, psychedelic stuff. I've loved it ever since I came across his release, Music for Mushrooms, ever since throwing that on during a meditation session, and everything he's released since has been absolutely stellar, which is a lot, I must say. The man is pretty prolific, but on the note of Music for Mushrooms, he has a documentary by that name coming out in the coming months. He has a lovely pod called 10 Laws as well, which I believe I've guested on once, maybe twice. I mouth noise a lot of microphone. It all kind of blends together. We've also, I would say, become pals over the years, which is not only a privilege, but leads to that familiar, effortless, mercurial fun flow, my favorite kind of mind meld to partake in. All of the portals that you will require for East Forest are in the description. Same for Third Eye Drops. On that note, do me a favor, tickle that algorithm with a like, a sub, a comment, a share. It is a fickle little alien that drives the YouTube algorithm. We must consistently get his attention if this thing's going to grow. I must also remind you, we've got hundreds of mind melds that are only extant in the audio dimension, including several with East Forest, so do subscribe to Third Eye Drops wherever you listen to podcasts. And finally, would you like to enter the Wonder Lodge deeper? Meet like-minded, curious souls, get rewards like stickers, pins, shirts, and more, hang out with me and other patrons on Zoom, then join over at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. I would love to riff with you there. But for now, my friends, let's meld minds with East Forest. Welcome back, my friend. Fresh out of the eclipse consciousness. Ready to share the archetypal wisdom of the shadow and the light.
Yeah, we got all the answers. So just us, though. We got the eclipse wisdom, got beamed down into our third eyes, the pineal glands, and we now understand.
The cave of Brahma. You know what I'm talking about with that?
I don't know. Is that a Jesus reference?
Sure, why not? No, it's one of those things where, you know how there's this line of mysticism where everything is like a euphemism for some kind of biological or neurological process. Like they'll conflate, maybe not conflate, they'll mix the idea of like kundalini going up, the spine with like cerebrospinal fluid. And what you really need to do is get the cerebrospinal fluid into this chamber in the brain. And the
Ah,
mystics knew that this was called this like the something fourth ventricle or third ventricle. I don't know. And if you get the cerebrospinal fluid up there, then you get the experience of enlightenment. And this is the same type of thing where they'll like, show the image of the split brain next to the Eye of Horus and be like,
I mean, it's
it's
Kundalini or like, Mantak
ooh,
cosmic orbit.
what is that?
Oh, that's that.
Sounds like a dish that you would see at like a
Yeah, that's the whole like men aren't supposed to ejaculate thing
oh
because you're
yes.
yeah, and you're supposed to save it, and then you're edging in an orgasm, but then you have to move the energy in this cosmic orbit up through your, just like you're saying, your spine up into your brain and back down again, and that's this he calls it, I believe, the cosmic orbit. And
Ooh.
according to him, like, like you're aging yourself. You're just giving away your life force every time you give it away. And it's like maybe a couple times in your life for procreation, you let that go. But that's his. Just saying this comes from many different angles, shall we say?
Yeah,
What a
yeah.
way to start.
So
What a way
so
to start.
so the orbit is it needs to go from the balls to the brain and then
Yeah,
back
like the
down to the balls.
prostate. Yeah, so from the base chakra, and you
Ah, yes.
do. If I, this has been a long time since I read his book, but I believe it's like essentially like a Kegel type exercise, and you would practice these muscles, and it's also a visualization. So it's partly physical, partly I don't know, figurative, and you're moving not just actual energy, but like I don't know if it's fluid or something to your, but it's definitely energetic. You're moving it up through your spine, all the way up into the crown of your head, and then it's supposed to kind of then waterfall back down. There's
Mm.
this cycling, this orbit of the energy, and that's how you become a powerful lover, and are like these tantra stuff.
Dude, I can't believe you're giving this information out for free. This is
Yeah. Oh
this
well.
is
Hey, I'm just the messenger here. Um, I wouldn't say that. I mean, look, it makes some sense on one level. It's like it's not just about different forms of orgasms or lengthening lovemaking. I think it's supposed to be also about sort of like tantric revelations of you do that and you have this. I mean, orgasm is a kind of cosmic consciousness where things really break down and stop for a second, and that's your little eclipse. Where that's probably why one of the reasons why people are into it. It's a break from the doldrum of thinking and problems and all that kind of stuff. It stops the gears. It's a kind of psychedelic moment.
yes. Speaking of stopping the gears, I might have like the perfect weird thing to cap this strange way to start the mind meld off, which is on the day of the eclipse. I was talking
Yeah.
to this guy Tom Matt, which is now this has become a very controversial podcast. But anyway, I was telling the story about how Jung at some point goes and visits this schizophrenic in a hospital. And the schizophrenic is like looking out the window at the sun, rambling, and he's talking about like something to do with the sun's penis. And of course, Jung is just
Hmm.
like, what? Like, what? Okay. But then years later, he reads, and again, I'm forgetting where he reads this. It's some esoteric text where they literally talk about, he's the schizophrenic's talking about the wind being caused by the sun's penis. And Jung
Seems
ends
like
up
a stretch. I
literally,
don't know.
literally. I mean, that's a long way to
Yeah.
go, just but but uh but then years later, Jung reads this in some esoteric text, the idea of like this tube like phallus coming out of the sun and causing the wind to move. So, this is one of the things that he cites as potential evidence for, yeah, it's not great to be schizophrenic, of course. However, they might be tapping into some kind of collective unconscious information, archetypal information at times. And that's a very odd overlap of all of like the very strange way we just started this podcast,
But
I
is
feel like.
that schizophrenia and schizophrenics often that's their quote unquote gift is finding the strange connections and overlap between seemingly unconnected things. That becomes their terror. Is that
Right.
the wind just kicked up, and when I feel that on my left cheek, that's an indication that this week is going to have 32 demons. Now I have to do this ritual to ward them off. I did a podcast with Shane Moss, Shane Moss, the
Yeah, of course, yeah.
comedian, and it was really fascinating because he really outlined the times he has really lost his way, and he's been hospitalized, I think at least once, and he went through in detail like what that process is like, and it's part of like synchronicities for him.
Right.
Can be a harbinger of like, oh, watch out. I got to be really on top of things, as opposed to everybody else. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, fun. The universe is playing with me. Yay. And
Yeah.
it's the opposite for him.
100%. And Jung says the same thing, actually. And I've said this quote or bastardized this quote so many times, but he essentially says that for the individual who seems to think that synchronicities are orbiting them and it's something to do with their own ego, like that is essentially a schizophrenic interpretation of something, and probably it involves a lot of projection. But if you chalk synchronicity up to a true example of what he calls cosmic sympathy or correspondence, in that there are these hidden connections between things that are not catalyzed by my ego, yet also require my psyche to participate in them to be recognized. That's very interesting. And that overlaps with what essentially every ancient source of wisdom says, right? That in some way, we are all one. We are all interconnected. This barrier between physicality and mentality is an illusion to some extent. And sometimes the illusion evaporates, or there's some kind of a flash of insight that seems to show the true nature of
Yeah.
reality, or at the very least show that this physical reality is underpinned by some kind of a priori unity of mental and physical or something,
Well, hey, that happens anytime you go into the grocery store for me and I see like broccoli romanesco, the spiral
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah, yeah.
And I'm like, you gave it away, it's,
Yeah,
it's something, but
fractal vegetables.
synchronicity, it's like, it's true that it doesn't exist unless you choose it. Like your recognition of it is what makes it a thing. So in many ways, there's some kind of line there between delusion and, I don't know, entering the doorway of some kind of deeper meaning. And maybe that's part of the point too. But absolutely, like, it almost makes it more interesting because all of the stuff of Revelation, like conspiracy in general, like I saw all these uninteresting conspiracy theories around the eclipse.
Right, yeah.
And I'm like, how come conspiracy theories are never positive? Like, never. It's never like they're all conspiring. The government is going to make you blissful. Watch out.
Right,
It's going to be a bliss bomb. And I just wonder. It's like, why is it always shadow?
Well, there are those pro-Noahic threads in the New Age community. Like I sort of feel like that's what the Pleiadian starseed people are. That that there's some benevolent.
But you see that as a conspiracy, like a conspiracy of love, I guess, or it's like a secret work, like behind the curtain. It's like, don't worry about it because the Pleiadians are on it. They're going to swoop down, or they're in control.
Yeah. Just keep your jizz orbits tight. And
Barbara Marx Hubbard.
But yeah, man, we've gone so many places in such a small amount of time.
Well, that's what podcasts are for,
especially
just
with
bouncing around the generalizations.
Especially with people like you, who, I'm sure I'll have said this in the intro by this point, but you and I have been at least acquainted pretty well. Like, I'd say we're at least homies in spirit, in that we have these conversations from time to time. We're into a lot of the same things. We express these things sometimes in similar ways, sometimes in different ways. But one of the things I love about these conversations is that we just can come in to conversations like this because we have so much similar philosophical and cultural context that we can just like riff on these things and just pick up on each other's cues or non-cues.
I guarantee if they skip ahead to 30 minutes in, maybe 35, we'll find coherence. It will all have meaning, I think.
This is
Usually, I've noticed
coherent
that's
for
how a lot
me.
of podcasts work. It's a spiraling.
Yes,
So we're
definitely.
getting there. We do know each other, but at the same time, I saw you in person for the first time at the MAPS conference, and I was struck by your height. And that
Oh,
always
yeah?
throws me from podcast. Anytime I'm with someone on Zoom and then I meet them, it's always like they're much shorter or much taller than I had in my
Wait,
mind. Like,
which one was I to you?
you're taller.
Okay, I'm not that
Yeah.
tall, so I'm
Well,
kind of shocked
I
you
don't
say
know.
that.
But see how the camera's looking down on you a little bit? So maybe I
Yeah.
perceived you as shorter.
How tall are you?
5'11".
Oh, dude, we're the same height.
I don't know, man. Maybe you're
We
wearing
are.
boots. All I know is that I met Shane, another one. He's a very tall
Oh,
man.
he's very
and I
tall.
think it's the first thing I said to him. I was like, nice to see you in person. You're very tall.
Yeah. Yeah, he is.
So maybe you want to get your camera down,
Yeah.
And then,
a little behind the scenes information. The way that I actually have, so I do have like a DSLR, but it's above the screen.
Above your
So it just kind of
screen.
goes straight
Yeah.
down. So it gets that. Yeah, I know what you're saying. I've actually thought about this. This is a really interesting conversation for people, but perhaps a more interesting conversation that I feel like if you really wanted to unite everything spooky, everything mysterious, everything that keeps you up at night from a spiritual perspective, I think that it really is perspective itself. And this leads back into synchronicity and everything else, because to your point about synchronicity, it requires your participation, right? For
Yes.
it to occur in a meaningful way. And when you start, and this is not just people who have like alternative theories of cognitive science or perception. Like this, from my understanding, is a pretty mainstream understanding of perception and cognitive science, is that they're not denying the material world in the way that some do. But what they're saying is that when the model through which you perceive the world is essentially a simulation of the brain. And there are various ways they come to this conclusion. But we'll just, if you can trust me on that. And then you ask yourself the impossible to answer question of, okay, so what is the reality past my perception of what the reality is? That leads to both the ultimate mystery and the ultimate schizophrenic potential, because now you're in a place where you're sort of admitting to yourself that I don't know what is beyond my perception, but I do know that my perception itself seems to be illusory. And yes, it's important to keep me alive. Yes, it's telling me, if not real information about the reality that's out there, information that I need to know to survive. It's doing that for sure. But beyond that, the fact that we're always in this sort of, I guess this like Kantian sort of scenario where we're prisons of our own cognition and we're prisons of our own perception, and that everything that has ever been yielded through science, through sense, through whatever, is stuck in the prison of our own human perception. And that is the catalyst for either schizophrenia or spirituality, I think personally. Or maybe you can maintain an agnostic distance and be like, yeah, that's just what it is, whatever. I can't imagine that, but
Well, I think that's coming through the lens of mind, though, because to me, the way we dance outside those boundary conditions is through art, is through silence, is through beauty, metaphor. Like the whole point of that to me is ways that we can break through, if not the only way, besides certain practices and psychedelic medicines that give us tastes of it. But that's what art is for me. It's like something that can break through the boundaries of the typical universe. I mean, music in itself, just in the psychedelic space, has some strange ability to completely function in a space on a high dose of psilocybin or other tryptamine where you're in the music becomes a space, it becomes the translator, it becomes the mechanism, it becomes the message itself, and all of that just works. And then that very same song you can listen to here in this three-dimensional grounded reality, and it still functions. And there's things like that I think that's the purpose of art. So in some ways I'd push back. I say we have the ability to space travel in a way or dimensionally shift all the time. And it's by like flow states and creative states.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things that what you're saying really reminds me of is how imminent it is when it happens to you. You know, like for instance, to use that same example, if you listen to an East Forest song on the Natch, and then you listen to an East Forest song in an altered state, the difference is massive. Yet it's maybe it's coherently incoherent, but there's something very imminent about the extra dimension that it reveals. There's always this idea, I think, when we're walking around in consensus reality, that another dimension is like a hidden layer of reality that's not here. It's like above this layer or like below this layer. But when you alter your perception and more of reality seems to be revealed, you're like, oh, yes, if there are other dimensions, if there are other intelligences, information, whatever it is, it's here and it's in me and it's in my consciousness already. It's not in some far off place. Like it's right here and it's very real. And that may not sound like a huge revelation, but when you tap into that, it's like a massive, oh yeah, oh
Dude,
yeah, I remember this.
that's old teachings too, that there's nothing to learn or earn. It's like peeling back an onion, spiritual revelation, mystical experiences are almost always falling back into like, oh man, it was here all along type feeling. But for instance, you know that phrase you say consensus reality? I mean, is there even consensus now on what reality is in our post-truth world? We don't
No.
share a consensus reality, and that's sort of the fracturing and the breaking down of what it means to be in this world today. Is that many of us don't feel we're all in the same world or reality. We're
Yeah,
not sharing the same reality, which is
totally, man.
fucking wild. The eclipse itself, we talked about the conspiracy theories and stuff. I think that is essentially just not just a different viewpoint, that's a different reality. Like what is even going
It
on or
is.
what is even happening? Uh,
Yeah.
of course, politically we see this, but it really is bleeding into, in some ways, maybe it's the way that our extreme reality tunnels through social media and the things that we see in our own little tribe and camps online can change our brains to the effect where, I mean, talk about choice. It's sort of unconscious choices that then become unconscious choices to the point where like you don't even know, like you were walking the dog and now the dog's walking you in a sense. Like you got the leash on your neck and you don't even realize it or who's walking you where, and you're just
hmm
going. You're just in it now. You're in the river.
And this is, I think, this is not trivial. Like this isn't just. This is going to determine how you think about politics or what you say online or who you associate with. In extreme circumstances, like there was some woman, I think she was an astrologer, who like murdered her family and committed suicide, like leading up to the eclipse. And she was like ranting online about like, this is the apocalypse, wake up, like this is happening now, like that.
Wow.
That's how extreme this can get. So I don't know what to, and I'm not railing against anything by saying that. I'm not saying, I'm not railing against astrology. I'm not railing against any particular worldview. But what I'm worried about is the sort of myopia and inflexibility of thinking that ever allows someone to really believe they know what the fuck is going on. Because, like, so I just finished this incredible, sprawling book called Passion of the Western Mind by Richard Tarnas. And it's the type of thing you read and you realize just how much of an intellectual micro penis you have. You're just like, oh, there's people on the planet that are capable of writing something like this. And it's an exhaustive history of Western thought and philosophy, going all the way back, starting with pre-Socratic philosophers, going all the way up to modern day, postmodern, quantum physics, everything. And what you see through all of these cycles and insights, I mean, there's a lot of things you see, but one thing you see is a always under construction view of reality that we can look at now from a postmodern perspective and be like, oh yeah, we have sort of tabulated and understood and took all of these things into account, and now we're sitting in this privileged position of being able to uh, dance with all of it or something. But another thing that you appreciate is that there's not a monolithic truth. There's like constant battles for what truth is. And there's like new thinkers that come in and disrupt the status quo. And then, it goes through this familiar grammar of idea evolution where the old status quo wants to hold on and the new disruptive idea is like really scaring people and whatever. But what one of the things I will say for what I said at the beginning just before, like that you do get to dance with all this perspective, is although I do not come away from a book like that thinking that I know that I know what's up, I do come away with this insight of, whoa, I don't really know what reality is, and our understanding of it seems to be getting a little more clear on one hand, but every time it gets more clear, it's like we lose something. The easy low-hanging fruit example is you can have the scientific enlightenment, but you're going to lose God. You're going to lose the mythopoetic view that everybody rooted their reality in. It's like there's always a kind of like weird mercurial trade-off in coming to some kind of big disruptive realization about reality. And
thank God though we can't just put it in a box or put our finger on it, because you're right. Then it would be bereft of any more myth or meaning. Yeah, but that's sort of like if things are breaking down in a way, or the boundaries are blurring. You could also look at that as a positive thing. Maybe that's some sign of a kind of merging that wasn't possible before, that had to go hand in hand with technology or like a web of interconnection like the internet, perhaps even AI. I mean, I'm not as sanguine about AI at all, but for instance. And so I've kind of feeling it's sort of like the Higgs boson or something. Like the smaller we try to search, not only is it an endless path, but the bigger and the bigger the device we have to make. It seems like a Tower of Babel, almost obviously on its face. Like eventually you make a collider that's literally the diameter of the equator of the Earth. And we're like, we think we now have seen evidence of the evidence of the real God particle. And like, now we have the universe and by the balls. And of course, there'll probably just be more and more and more and more. I don't know that, but it seems to just, you look from the outside in, and it seems to be that's what's going on. So in that way, when all these things start to just get squishy, perhaps sort of like, when the ground isn't as firm, maybe the good news is like, well, the boundary has just gotten softer. The veil's a bit thinner. And in that space, there is the opportunity for deeper levels of meaning, because it's going beyond the hardness of things that we are just bumping into with our heads before.
Yeah. And that's what I think, to do the ritualistic of blowing smoke up the guest's ass, but I truly mean this, is that's why I think what
Please,
you do
blow.
what you do is so important, man, because we do live in this hyper fractured epistemological wasteland. Like it kind of feels like we live in a reality where around the same time the literal nuclear bomb went off, some kind of psychic nuclear bomb went off, and we're just like living in the exploded remains of how we used to make sense of reality or something. And one of the things that I think you have to do to get beyond that is get beyond concept and turn the frontal lobe off. Turn the understanding part of the brain that wants to figure things out and wants to label things and categorize things. Turn that off and go into a deeper kind of consciousness that's
Yeah,
more.
feeling, right? Versus thinking.
Yeah, but it's weird because it's like this hyper. It is feeling, but it's also very cosmic and expanded. It feels like you're both, in one sense you're more embodied, but you're also more like the mind opens up beyond the ego, and the horizons of
Yes.
your reality expand at the same time. And getting into that kind of a space, of course it brings more questions, but it also has a way of just of turning, not just turning down the volume of the ego, but putting it in its place and being like, remember that you're just this little guy. You're just this little tiny guy right here.
Dude, absolutely, man. It's the softener. I mean, I think that is the goal of any spiritual practice. Practice meaning repeated something, some sort of exercise or process so that it's softening the edges of the grasping of the ego being a very terrible master. Uh, but I mean, we're in such a mind state, such an external in state as a culture and as a people that we're speeding up in a way where we're pumping in more information and doing more. The promise of the future, the Jetsons,
Mm-hmm.
was always that more automation, more robots, essentially more AI is supposed to lead to more leisure, and eventually we don't have to do anything except chill. And it's been the opposite. Not for a long time. It's progressively just more and more pressures, more and more information, more and more busy. It seems we all
Yeah.
get. And so, that's like the promise of our future in a way. We have to take hold of the horns ourselves. It's not going to just happen naturally that there's not more and more pressures, but we're not going to think our way out of it. It's definitely like, I think we're losing our way from feeling as a people, and that's also why we find these extremes of things that people are into, where they can find any kind of feeling. Maybe whether it's like super violent imagery type things, or God forbid, total breaks and mental illness, violent acts, but adrenaline type things, or just
Yeah.
sort of like these extremes that are symptoms of our times.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny because, and this is going to sound so pedantic and overly philosophical. Welcome back to Third Eye Drops. But when you say we can't think our way out of it, I immediately thought of what is even the it here? Like the thing that we're trying to think our way out of. Because I think asking that question brings up a really interesting insight, and it's the why of what it is that's motivating innovation. Like, you can get so swept up in the flow of information that, to use your metaphor from before, the dog is walking you, right? Like, the information itself it captures your attention, and before you know it, you're just caught up in this flow of information and impulse that completely turns off the why, that completely turns off the what am I even doing here, what and I'm talking about in a meta sense, like, why am I here, what am I doing? And I'm guilty of this all the time, just getting caught up in streams of information and then looking back at the last 30 minutes to an hour or however long it's been, being like, what in the fuck am I doing? And it feels like all of civilization is spending more and more time in that mode of consciousness, in this like mercurial, and not mercurial in like the hermetic esoteric sense, but mercurial in the sense of just more information for the sake of more information, and more novelty for the sake of more novelty. And it just becomes this big circle jerk of every different flavor of novelty and outrage and insight and whatever it is. And that is a sort of like careening toward nothingness kind of consciousness that I don't think humanity can survive long term in. And I don't know what's going to get us out of that, but I know in some tiny way you're helping get people out of that mode of thinking, at least for a brief period of time.
I don't know, man. We need to. We're anesthetizing. I do sympathize with the pain out there and the trauma that's been racked up generation after generation, and people really bereft of like good solutions or ways to deal with that. And so they're dealing with it in ways essentially of just trying to disassociate and numb, because that gives you short-term relief, which we've all dipped our toe into those waters. But I don't know. But it kind of takes, for the kind of change that we need to see systemically and in society, it takes probably really big pressures. I mean, I pray for the least amount of suffering, but I doubt that we could do the kind of changes we need fundamentally without, on some level, being forced to. That's a bit human nature.
It's become old hat at this point to talk about this, but I think it's a fun thing to revisit from time to time, because there's always new spins on it, new innovations, new failings, new victories to this conversation. And this conversation is the race between the supposed awakening of consciousness and disaster. And my answer always used to be that I think it's both at the same time. It's like more of both at the same time.
Yeah.
And I still kind of think that, but I'm personally getting more worried, I think. And maybe it's an artifact of the geopolitical instability, to even just call it geopolitical, mass human suffering that's caused by other humans, and the fact that that's just seems to be intensifying. And then there's all the other things that were already there on top of that. And then there's more epistemological and ontological landmines going off in terms of like AI, potential alien disclosure, all these other things. And I don't think I can always convince myself that maybe I can arrange those pieces in some way that lead to an awakening. But it almost kind of feels like, okay, there's like, do you remember the scene in Avengers when Doctor Strange is like, I've looked at 47,000 realities and there's one that we win. That's kind of what it feels like we're in right now. It's like, yeah, there is like an awakening scenario, and every other one feels like, whoops, we blew ourselves up.
Yeah, and it may be like you're saying that it's like getting a good whooping to really learn your lesson. Sort of as above, so below. That's how it works on a smaller scale. Sometimes like you really get your ass kicked. I mean, that's how I learned some lessons. And then I'm like, man, I went through the fire, and it was a long fire. It's like, well, I will not repeat that. That's for sure. And it's almost a hypervigilance after that. I mean, we are getting our ass kicked, but barely, really. I mean, some people more than others, but it's like there's ways for it to go. And it may be that that's a multi-generational thing. I mean, it definitely will be. And in that, whatever ashes remain, hopefully the stories that are being passed along too about what not to repeat.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, my friend, I mean, the aliens that's the least of our problems. Speaking of the atomic bomb, I mean, I've heard that when that went off, that's when it was sort of like the beacon went out to the Galactic Federation, so to speak. They're like, okay, that's sort of like the prime directive has been now, we press the button of like, we need to intervene because the monkeys can now kill themselves and everyone. But beyond that, it was more like there's a cosmic significance to splitting the atom. That like if there's black holes in every atom or whatever it is, it's like, yo, you're messing with the balance, the equilibrium of the fractal void.
Yeah. I heard recently that's the version of it that I've always heard. And then I heard recently, I can't remember where I heard this. I'm trying to remember that the thing that made the whatever they are's take notice, the interdimensional beings
Jellyfish.
or the aliens or whatever they are, take notice is that when you do something like set off an atomic bomb, you're actually affecting, I can't remember specifically what it was, but you're affecting something to do with the way that they traverse reality in like using that technology with the,
Like you're
creating
messing up the
the
highway.
yeah,
Or
yeah.
yeah.
So you literally like caused some of the yeah, I think it's like the speculation was man, I wish I could remember where I heard this, but I think the speculation was they may have caused some to crash or malfunction or something. And now that's why they don't want us mad. I would love it to be that
Or probably we're
yeah.
just messing with like them. It's the equivalent of the medallion status for the frequent flyers in
Yeah,
space. It's
yeah.
like they were
Right.
Delta Diamond, and like, man, you just bumped us down to
Yeah.
gold. That is not cool.
We're
We got
not
to get
riding
down
in
there.
coach. We're not riding in coach
Yeah,
consciousness.
somebody's gonna fix this right now. Yeah.
Yeah. Coach consciousness. I like that idea. Yeah, but I mean, well, I mean, I'll take whatever route into the extraterrestrial or whatever they are's conversation that I'm handed. But because it, like I was saying to you before we started recording, this is one of those conversations that I think people who not only watch this channel but just in the in on YouTube in general kind of can't get enough of because I think it's such an interesting question and there's this prevailing idea of like, oh yeah, we could get disclosure and no one cares and whatever, but I don't think that's true. I think what people don't care about is they don't want to hear the same takes over and over again on what it is, and they don't just want to hear about like this is what they're saying in they're coming out of the closed door meetings and saying they're not learning anything. Like people are tired of that shit. People want to hear some unhinged exploration, I think, of these things, and not completely unhinged, but speculation that's grounded in something that they're not going to hear in the quote unquote mainstream media. And I think one of the things that I'm always shocked is not explored more is Jung's take on UFOs, because Jung, in almost everything that he did, I think has the most incredible insight on the UFO question of anyone I've ever heard. And in some ways, we kind of already indirectly explored it. But are you familiar with his take at all? Have you ever looked
Lay
into
it
that?
on me. I'm guessing
So,
it has something to do with the unconscious.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Um, so in his time, for some context, like there was UFO news beginning to go around, like flying saucer news beginning to go around. So he started looking into it, and I'm totally just pulling this from memory here, not fresh on my mind. So he started looking into it, and he got right into the most interesting angle of it, I think, which is how this phenomenon seems to mirror strange, esoteric, occult, mystical phenomenon that have happened all throughout the ages. People seeing angels, people seeing demons, people like fairy beings, whatever. And what he speculated is not just so some people, and I think I've probably said this before too mistakenly, not just that people are projecting some part of the unconscious into reality and it's appearing to them in the form of UFOs. That's like half of it. But the other half is that there is something there. There is something going on, but something about our psyche and our cognition is limited in such a way that we take some pre-existing concept and we have to project it on this incredibly anomalous, perhaps higher dimensional thing, because whatever it is, we have no symbol system or way to actually, you know, ascertain it with our senses. So we have to project something
Mm.
unconscious onto it. And that's how it becomes an angel or a demon or an alien or like in the 19th or no, I think it was early 20th century, like an airship or whatever it is that people
Well,
are
it's
seeing.
still a lot of like objects in the sky that take all sorts of shapes from like blobs to more like, triangular ship type things. I mean, that's what makes it very strange too, is like we seem to be seeing more of that, or maybe we just have more iPhones, or I don't I don't know. But there's evidence of it, of course, that goes back a long time where you see it in paintings and things like that. So it doesn't seem like it just showed up in the
Right.
20th century. But It's interesting though to conflate together UFOs and craft, or literally things in the sky, and then like angels, fairies, that sort of world. And from more of a shamanic perspective, I think they would be more blended. It'd be like the universe is just completely alive with life of all around us in all sorts of different dimensions, of all different shapes and sizes and motivations. It's all there. The plant life, the plant spirits,
Yeah.
the underworlds, the uh, the inner life, and then extra dimensional beings, other planets. And that, I guess, I mean, if we look at the universe of how big it is, just optically, it's
Yeah.
unfathomably large. I suppose just looking at our own planet and how much life there is here, just almost infinite little bits from microbes and viruses all the way up to mammals. Why wouldn't it be like that? Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm definitely suspicious that it's both things are going on. I mean, clearly there's experimental aircraft. There's I'm open to all the popular hypotheses. There's a breakaway group. There's like a secret group that did develop anti-gravity technology, or or those are just defense contractors that have developed this stuff and they sort of like broke off and did their own thing. Whatever. Like, yeah, and I believe people have shown that for certain, like those triangular crafts actually exist and they actually are experimental aircraft that have been built. But I don't think it's like I don't understand why anyone would jump to the conclusion that it's either this or it's that. It's like, yeah, clearly that's a thing. But then also people are seeing these other things that I cannot imagine are crafts made in a factory. So like my friend, do you know the story of that Chris Bledsoe guy?
Yeah. Well, no, but I was like, that sounds very familiar. It'll just come back to me.
He's been on a few big pods. His son Ryan Bledsoe is also out there. He's been on Trussell a couple times.
Maybe that was it. Yeah.
But yeah, so they're like a family that's
Oh,
been
yeah.
seeing these objects and like orbs essentially, and then but also like projections of beings and just really out there stories, but very compelling, very stories that seem to be at least anecdotally corroborated by people within the government and different intelligence agencies and stuff like that. He has a book out called UFO of God. And it's the type of story where you hear it and it's so fantastical that you're like, I don't know, man. But it's such a compelling story that you have to listen to it. But what's crazy is I've become good friends with this girl, Molly, who does the Back from the Borderline podcast. And she, after hearing Ryan, his Chris Bledsoe's son, talk about this on Trussell, actually, she reached out to him and asked him if he wanted to do a podcast. And he eventually, after they talked for a while, was like, why don't you and your husband come out to the house? Because if you come out to the house and you see it yourself, like this
Really?
conversation is going to take on a whole different level of, of potency.
Where is their house? Why is this house so special?
I think it's North Carolina. It's either North or South Carolina. I don't know. And I don't think he doesn't claim to know either. There's a whole story I could sort of nutshell and regurgitate for you, but it's like his whole life was turned upside down. He had Crohn's disease. His business was failing. He was just in like a really, really desperate, like almost suicidal sort of point in life. And he was just kind of wandering around talking to himself and praying for help, basically. And then like giant orbs appeared and he was like scared out of just scared shitless. Lost a bunch of time apparently. Like as everybody was like, where have you been? You've been gone for hours and hours. But then his family. So then that was the thing that kicked it all off. And they sort of never stopped appearing to him after that. And then his family eventually starts seeing them too. And then, as they start sharing the story, intelligence agencies come like poking around and like, is this real? And then as they find out it's real, they start like subjecting him to tests and bringing him into like classified places and like testing metamaterials on him and all, just there's all this stuff. So anyway, my friend Molly goes, I consider her to be very credible and very, like a friend. We text all the time. Um, and she's like, she saw orbs. She saw an orb like come toward her, fly by her head. Like she saw it. So, and then when these tales of high weirdness get closer to you, it becomes much harder to be like, I don't know, man. This is,
It just seems like
yeah,
a lot of the people who see the orbs, I'm not talking about your friend Molly, but the ones who like are channeling and so forth, they always have
yeah,
to turn it into money in some sort
right.
of like
That's
pyramid
true.
scheme of like, pay me my subscription and it's $1,000, half for an hour, and I'll channel it, give you the answers. And the message is always very typically benevolent or special, but there's always that money piece.
Yeah.
That's why I liked Edgar Casey. Uh, but
Yeah. He's interesting.
yeah, he's what would he be tweeting? If he was alive today, I don't know. Would he have his Patreon, his platform? And like we both have Patreons. I'm just saying
Right. Yeah.
that, like, we. I don't know. It's almost like we've corrupted the message is corrupted inside the system that it's living in, that it's trying to transmute and transform. And so by the nature of it, it needs to come from the sickness within out. It's just a messy process.
Yeah.
It's hard to know. It's so hard to know.
It is. Yeah. And I think with him in particular, you could make either argument because on one hand, he has a book and he's gone on some podcasts, but on the other hand, he does seem to be somewhat private and somewhat like, I don't want all this, I don't know what to think. I don't personally know what to think. I think it's interesting enough to pay attention and be curious, but and I get so many mixed. Anytime this comes up, I get so many mixed comments. I'm like, people being, I've seen orbs too. I believe him. I don't believe him. He's a con man. And yeah, I mean, I think that just speaks to the ontological shock and epistemological shock that is everywhere these days. It's especially when you start to engage with this kind of material. And again, I've said this a lot recently, but do you know who Bernardo Kastrup is, the idealist
Yeah, I
philosopher?
had him on my show.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, beautiful.
Yeah. I mean, I just try to hang on for dear life
I know, right?
intellectually, but
Yeah, yeah.
he's great. Very nice man.
Yeah, brilliant, obviously. But like anybody who's curious, you may have seen that he became interested in all this UFO stuff. And last time I had him on this show, it was sort of like I'm telling everyone I am backing away from UFOs. Like I'm going to
Too
publish
much
this
heat.
article. It's just too, you can't, it's like every time you think you might be on to something, it's just like you encounter vapor, or there's just like another layer and another layer of something to try to make sense of. And so he's like, I'm just going to be interested from the sidelines, but not in this community. And I feel like I'm beginning to dance on the edge of the community because it is fun to talk about. I do like having these conversations and hearing people's stories. And I'm not saying I wouldn't have other people on who are in this space, but I also don't want to be reduced to that space because I think that's really when your thinking becomes captured, where even if it's not your thinking personally, now you're contributing to the narrative that other people run on the hamster wheel of. They're just like watching this shit for hours and hours on end, and there's no answers, and it's just making reality that much harder to make sense of. So I guess I'm ambivalent on it. I have mixed feelings.
Well, when I looked into it deeply years ago, I just got tired of looking at little dots on a screen of light. At a certain point, you're like, I've seen them all. There's nothing more to learn here, and there's no bottom to this. I think I told you this in one of our previous conversations. Like I went to an alien conference in like 2000 whatever, and I think the
no
biggest
aliens were there. I bet.
Well, maybe they were, but the biggest takeaway was that what people see, like eyewitness accounts, so to speak, are just horrible. I mean, people were pointing at shit that I'm like, orbs from the photographs, it's dust and it's it's obvious, or they're looking at the ISS space station, and to them that they're screaming out that it's a ship. And for others, like they can look on an app, like it's definitely the space, and they still didn't care. So, I mean, it just, lowered the bar or raised the bar for me, thinking on like the things I hear from people's accounts. You just got to take it with a huge grain of salt. Whatever they saw, they did see that. It's just, again, where's the truth anymore? And we're going to get into a space where maybe we're very much maybe halfway there, where anything we see online, let alone read, but certainly soon with videos, audio, there will be nothing to hold on to, or to verify. And it's already in a space of like, well, it's really just like ideas anyway, and people are holding on to those as if there's some kind of truth because so and so said it or this person said it. So in that way, I don't think we're going to be getting a solidity anytime soon. And
No.
believe me, I want to know. I want to know more than anybody, and it just doesn't seem to be the case. It's like you're going squatching. If you're going out there looking for the Sasquatch and you run into another squatcher, and they'll say, "Have you seen him?" And you'll say, "I haven't yet." And they'll say, "Well, you're just not ready." When you're
Right.
ready, he'll show himself to you. Perhaps humanity is squatching, and as a whole, we're not ready. We can't hold the integrity of that light beam. We'll blow apart. Or it's like, it's just not congruous with the way we're operating right now. I could definitely see that being the case. I mean, Jesus, we can't
Totally.
even handle the simplest of pieces of information without fucking it up. I mean,
Yeah.
we would kill each other if they land on the goddamn White House lawn. There would
Yeah.
be 50% of people be like absolute false flag, fake, blah,
Right.
blah, blah. And then the other group, and we'd just be splintering out and just being like,
I mean, what would you think? What would you think if like suddenly CNN, Fox News, all the news outlets started reporting it? Would you believe it? What
well,
would
I'd
go
be
through your mind, do you
skeptical.
think? Yeah.
But maybe it's just a fact of getting older. I tend to find myself a bit more in the middle in a more nuanced space. I think often a lot of these situations, I mean, not just aliens, but we don't allow much for nuance. And
Right.
oftentimes the explanations are far simpler and more mundane and just not very satisfying. It maybe just comes down to like stupidity and greed and short-term thinking and mass hysteria, as opposed to like grand schemes and planning. And it's like, maybe certain people out there have those ideas, but it's like, how about the idea that no one's in control? No one's driving this ship? It's far more frightening, but most likely the way it is. We're all just in these shared agreements. So
Mm-hmm.
You try to do research on anything these days, from what you're trying to eat to, I mean, you have to be your own detective with information. And on some
Totally.
ways, on some levels, it's easier because we have so much information, but there's no way to know. Like, we also then, if we had the CNNs and the Foxes and so forth, we would have individual people with their own phones and their own like gonzo journalism, so to speak. We'd be getting that information too, but it's a bit of a mess right now. I mean, maybe it's already happened, right? And it's like, it's just, we can't get it through the system.
Yeah.
And there's that idea that aliens have been walking amongst us, look just like us forever. Or even like crazier, people I've met who are like, I'm a hybrid.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Like, I
Oh, yeah.
woke up to what I am in my
Yeah.
life.
Yeah.
And that's a tough one to wrap my head around too.
Oh yeah. That. Yeah. And
And
it's
then they
not.
light language and they do the whole thing. I mean, I had someone who did that to me. They asked permission. Can I light language you? I was like, let's do this. And they like put their fingers on my rib and then started like speaking in tongues very fast. And you've heard that, I'm sure, the light
And you're like,
language.
hold on. I'm in no fap right now, please.
Well, it was over very quickly. And then within a few minutes, behind me on the wall was a praying mantis. And this is down in an area I had never seen a praying mantis in 15 years there. And it was just like behind me on the wall. It's those sort of strange moments. I don't know what to make of that.
Did they bring anything specifically up to you about praying mantises, or is that just like an association?
Well, it
in
was
your
in light
mind?
language, my friend. It was
Oh,
like,
true.
I didn't take that course in college. Right? There's no Duolingo for light language yet, and so I can't tell you what they were saying, but look. I feel that music, in a sense, is a kind of light language.
Oh yeah.
When I'm singing and I'm making up words. I don't even think about it anymore. But Rada jokes and calls it language light as our way of flipping it around. And it's the same thing. Again, I go back to like music and art. It's like these things aren't as mysterious as we think. They've been right in front of us all along. But I think artists are always like, well, yeah, that's how you get into these spaces. It's through creativity or sex, going back to our original, or like messing with food and your hunger. That's another way. But it's through often play and metaphor. It's all metaphor.
Yeah. Or deprivation. So any kind of deprivation, obviously molecules. And on that note, like there's a little bit of an entrance here to explore the visionary realm as it overlaps with the previous conversation and how they may be related or not. And mantises are interesting because that's one of those things where in popular, extraterrestrial lore, one of the races is like a mantis race.
Yeah.
And I'm always just like, okay.
Seems very inconvenient. Can you imagine being a giant mantis that's super intelligent? Like you can't even grab things properly. Like
yeah. What are
you don't have
how
a
did
thumb.
you make a spaceship?
I mean, it's like telling me, how do you make a spaceship if you don't have a thumb?
But the thing that the thing that I do think is kind of interesting is that's also, for whatever reason, one of the most common things people quote unquote see when they're tripping, particularly seemingly on ayahuasca retreats. It's like
DMT. It was
and DMT,
same thing,
right? Yeah,
I mean,
true,
same,
true.
overlap.
Yeah. So that is that's at least archetypally interesting, but it obviously also leads to the question of: is there some overlap there? Is there some I don't even reality in air quotes to whatever people are perceiving in those altered states in terms of it actually being a portal to see, again, I say another realm, but I actually think what we were talking about before in that realm. Like it is imminent. It's just like that we're not aware of it under normal circumstances. And I wonder, because you're somebody who's obviously got a tremendous amount of experience navigating this space. Have you come to any conclusions, or is that something that you both try to remain, you just occupy that suspension of belief and disbelief nuanced state on?
Well, it may be that there's things such as emanations, or I use that as a way of trying to understand. I was talking to Lama Sultram, a Buddhist Lama, and she told me it was just really awesome experience to be able to hang out with her and have these kind of conversations. And she mentioned, or I've heard that she's an emanation, and I had her on my show, but of a particular very high being from a very long time ago, like a female Buddha from a long time ago. And I was like, what does that mean? Tell me more about emanation versus reincarnation versus whatever. And she's like, well, it's kind of, and this is a paraphrase, but she sees it like she's like, well, I always had, I was interested in her teachings, and I already had the natural interest, and I became a Buddhist nun. And then she went up in Tibet. This is when she was younger on some trip, and she's going to this monastery, and the guy who runs it, or the main monk guy, had this dream before she arrived where he completely saw that she was this emanation and who she was, and that essentially this being was coming to them. And so when she arrived, without telling her, they were all there welcoming her.
Wow.
And then up to the throne, and had her sitting on the throne. And for 4 days, didn't say anything why. And the whole time she's not understanding, why am I being treated like this? I made some joke like, you must have thought maybe they're going to eat you. And this happened, I think another time where someone else had a similar dream. And I said, so what is that feeling like for you? Or what's that being an emanation of something? And she said, it's almost like, or maybe my interpretation of it was like being an ambassador, or being almost like an affiliate in a sense. It's like you have a connection, and you have a piece, a literal connection and a literal piece of that, let's call it greater oversoul. And I've even felt this on psychedelic journeys with my own sense of what I may be an emanation of. I think we all are in one way or another. But it's almost like, oh, you couldn't have all of that here. It's like, it's too much for this world, or you don't even need it. 1% in a sense, and you can she can be what she is. And I'm not saying she's 1%. I'm just using this as an example. So it could be that praying mantis or so forth, they're almost like echoes or emanations of things. And we always try to anthropomorphize and think of like a being as a being. Like I am
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard for us even to accept that like Michael is 1% of another being that has perhaps splintered off into many other beings all at the same time. And like, well, what about me? Right?
Right.
But then I'm not, you're telling me I'm just like the heel of this, of a greater being. It's like, well, you're
Yeah.
still the greater being. And so maybe the praying mantises is one way for us to understand it, or an emanation of like energies or beings that are far stranger or less physical than, I don't know. I mean, I think about
Yeah.
octopuses or cats. It's like lots
It
of
must be
things
hard
that.
during NoFap to think about that. I mean,
So it's like it could be that like it's just ways for it to interact and play in this
yeah.
world as zone. It's like fuck it, we're gonna be the praying mantis. That looks fun. Or
Yeah.
we'll be the
Yeah.
octopus.
I don't know why I thought it would be funny to like bring up some kind of octopus kink. That's like the most. That's like the most it's the most difficult thing to turn into any kind of like sex object in my mind. I don't know why I keep coming back to this, because dude, this is actually, I'm really excited to have this conversation about emanations and this idea that we may exist in a chain of beings, because I would say if there's any one rabbit hole I've been completely obsessed with over the last year and a half, it's the sort of Western esoteric rabbit hole, as it begins with like Pythagoreans, Platonists, and then going, down the centuries through the Neoplatonic mystics and the Hermetic mystics, and what eventually flows into today, into the like whole Western esoteric tradition. And what I have been so excited to find is that almost every single one of these Eastern ideas has an echo in Western esotericism. And for whatever reason, we've just like lost touch with this. Unless you're into like, you're like a scholar of this stuff, or you're just a massive nerd, people are not aware that there is essentially an equivalent idea of like a Platonic Hermetic bodhisattva, or like this idea that you're talking about, that being an emanation of some other god or being. And there was a practice that I heard about, and I can't remember which um Neoplatonic philosopher it was, but there's this podcast I'm obsessed with that I've mentioned a number of times called The Secret History of Western Esotericism. And the guy who does it is a PhD classicist, and he has studied esotericism specifically. So he's obsessed with this stuff, and everything is citations and just amazingly well researched. And he was talking about that there was this practice that they would do where they would figure out like what, either like what your daimon was connected to, or what you were a sort of emanation of, in the same way that they talk about it in mostly Tibetan Buddhist contexts. Yeah. And I think the reason we've largely lost it is because once, the Catholic Church got hegemony over what kind of spirituality was allowed to be practiced, and it's not even hegemony, like they would actively coerce whole populations into, I mean, already in like ancient Alexandria, you would get people who were being, murdered or arrested or whatever for being pagans, and that just intensified until there were basically almost no pagans, quote unquote, or they were just pushed into, really fringe underground communities, and they had to preserve all these ideas and rituals and stuff in secret. But I think it's probably due to the fact that we stamped out our own mystical tradition, that we've now become interested in Eastern traditions, because it's speaking to something that we see completely missing from our culture, and it's really difficult to find this stuff in any way that makes sense to us. So we literally go to the other side of the world to find it. But yeah, man, you also, you mentioned, the everyone's favorite overused yet potent esoteric adage of as above, so below earlier. And I actually have a video coming out on this probably this coming week. And the really key piece of wisdom that I think underpins all of this, that I think is really important for personal sense making. We're talking about all these far flung ideas and, epistemological and ontological shock and how hard it is to make sense of reality. Here is an idea that I really think brings spiritual perspective and a felt sense of I exist in a very real way that has spiritual significance built into it. And it's essentially like what all of this stuff that we're talking about orbits is that I don't know if any of these one particular things that we've talked about are true. However, what I do know is that nature seems to be telling us that there is a hidden overarching logic, mathematical pattern, interconnectivity that is not metaphorical and is actually very real. And you can read this in like Platonic dialogues like the Timaeus, or you can read this in like the Upanishads or whatever mystical Buddhist texts that were all interconnected. And that's all interesting. And I love that shit. But you can also literally look at the hierarchical mirrored patterns of nature. And it seems like this is a truth that is like all around us in any form. And that no matter what form we explore in, whether it's through going deeply inward, through mathematical rigor, through mystical contemplation or reading, we're just continuously coming back to this conclusion that there is this nested, hierarchical, interconnected reality that we are living pieces and manifestations of. We're not disconnected and like floating in random chaos. Like we are a part of this emanating cosmos. And it's not just like I might be an emanation of this or you might be an emanation of that. What all of these texts say is that the true reality underneath all of that is an actual kind of non-dual oneness that you can feel yourself under the right circumstances. And that's a kind of like revelation and spiritual goal that is not hypothetical. Like it's something that you can actually have an experience of. And it, at the very least, balms up a lot of that existential
Yeah, I'll say
shock.
that's one way to put it. It balms it up.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely soothes the soul to think. It's in some weird way the fact that we're attached to our individuality, but that's what causes us all of our pain. That must be the point. And working with that and wrestling with that is the real juju. I mean, that really is the game in town anyway, is the fact that we feel alone. And yet there are times where we recognize that we're not. And that great rediscovery every time it happens, you got to admit, it's about one of the most pleasurable things there is. And maybe it happens once in your life, or maybe it happens all the time. You're a little more practiced at that remembering. But it is a process of forgetting and remembering. And in that way, forgetting may be the point. The engine of remembering and forgetting is the engine of the universe. I sometimes call it the cosmic game of peekaboo, because it's just like it's nothing more than just forgetting and remembering for the sheer joy of it. And we've just turned the dial up to 11.
Yeah. And it seems like, again, all of these traditions, Eastern and Western, are sort of pinning it all back on you in a way that I think is scary, but it's also very freeing in that. So again, I'm drawing a massive circle around a lot of traditions here, but I think that it fits in that. What do they all seem to be saying? That we come from this kind of oneness through whatever circumstances, sometimes benevolent, sometimes malevolent. We have become an individuated drop in this interconnected net. And you can get really myopically focused on that individual being. But if you do that, it's just going to, like you're saying, lead you deeper and deeper into this sort of paradoxical suffering that you can never, you can't stop it from aging. You can't stop everything it loves from dying. You can't sit on the throne unless you're that woman who's an emanation of Avalokiteshvara or whatever she is. It's like there's all these things that you just can't get. Play that game as much as you want. Like nothing's going to happen, depending what your metaphysical beliefs are. But as you become more enamored in the mirror of the self, you're just going to suffer more. And it doesn't matter if it's Platonism or Buddhism or Hinduism. Like, of course, there are major differences in all of these schools of philosophy. But what they all agree on is you don't want to get stuck down in the passions and the ego and all of these like ephemeral self games that are temporary. You need to orient your consciousness toward a higher ideal, toward something that's not, and again, this is the beauty of these like interconnected systems of esoteric and philosophical thought, is it's not like a god who's hiding from you on purpose or is just like asking for your faith as a sort of, I don't know, like as a way to eventually transcend when you die. It's something that you can orient yourself toward here and now that is present. And if you start living at least with an interest toward that, life takes on a very mystical and beautiful character at the very least. Like it doesn't just suddenly heal all of your problems, but I think it does at least give you something meaty to explore in a real way it's not a fantasy. Like it's very much here and available if you're willing to orient yourself toward it.
Yeah. It's a vantage point of choice. And we were talking about you choose synchronicity is what allows it to have deeper meaning. It's the same process in what you're saying, I believe, that we get to choose how we wish to orient, and that kind of becomes the greater game. Ram Dass would say, like, when you discover that there really is only one game in town, I mean, once you sort of sense of like returning to wholeness or God or whatever you want to call it, I mean, what else is there after that?
Right.
And so once you have that sort of revelation, you get to choose where you aim towards, what horizon that you're moving towards. And it doesn't change the things along the path necessarily, but it most definitely gives it a different perspective. And that's crazy to think that like those kinds of subtle shifts can reorient your entire life. And you almost want it to be more. You want it to be an alien ship landing on the lawn and something very definitive and huge and big. And like there was that and then there was after. And instead, it seems to be much more soft and almost invisible in the sense of like it's just behind a thought in a sense and your own volition.
Yeah.
It's really beautiful. Also a bit confounding, I can agree. But once you fall into that, I think you feel more a part of something holistic as opposed to just out there adrift on your own.
Yeah. And as much as it doesn't feel like on a day-to-day basis we're having that UFO lands on the lawn type of experience, from even what I know of your own personal story, it seems like there was a moment like that for you when like and it kind of seems to me like when you decided to pursue this East Forest project, because this is a time, like for people who aren't familiar with his story, this is a time before this kind of music really exists. This is a time where you're not really sure what you're doing and you're like playing with this idea, and it's definitely inspired by exploring altered states of consciousness yourself and feeling like there's this rift and you have suddenly this strange desire to fill that void with your own creativity. And that can really from the right vantage point, seem equivalent to a UFO landing on the lawn. If you think about the trajectory that set you on, like that's pretty massive.
But at the time, of course, I didn't know that, and
Right.
I didn't even have that intention. So it's like it was much more. I don't think it would have happened in a sense if I knew what I was sort of choosing or agreeing to. All I knew is I was choosing to let go of other things. It wasn't so much what I was putting on, it was
Yeah.
just stripping away. And that goes back to that you, the revelation is the middle of the onion, or it's you fall
Yeah.
into it. And so it's been there all along. It's not something again that you earn. It's more that you allow. And in that sense, you don't know where that leads. And I most definitely didn't know. I didn't even label it as East Forest or a project or a job. Actually, it's quite the antithesis of that. It was more, this will be the opposite of what I've been trying to do before, which is more just a way of life of accepting the gift of what I felt in that moment. And that was
Mhm.
really all that it was. And that was enough, because everything else is just future thinking
Yes.
or past regret. I mean, there isn't anything else anyway. So I think you used that word before about how it is about presence in a sense. It's presencing. And whatever is presencing you is probably more true and real, because everything else is just a mental fabrication anyway.
Mhm.
I
What do you
mean,
mean by presencing you?
anything that is bringing you into just this,
Mm.
because it's always just been this. It's just this. This is it. And everything else is just an idea or a memory.
Mm.
And so practices that bring you into that when they actually do, all it's bringing you into a sense of beingness and bringing you into a sense of just feeling and awareness and equilibrium, because there's nothing else going on. And inevitably we grab onto something. And again, I think that's just the grist for the mill. That gives us something to do. But the good news is there's nothing to do.
Ooh.
But that's good news, because that means you don't, our birthright is what we are.
Yeah.
And we go through all these confabulations to hopefully accept that.
Yeah.
And maybe it takes a while. Maybe it doesn't. Some people seem to they vibe that a little faster.
To me that feels like a thing to do, but I also see what you're saying, because I think that in a sense it's an I don't know, it's both a doing and an undoing, but and that sounds completely like nonsensical obviously, but what I mean is that there's this, when I think to myself all of the sequence of events and obsessions that led to me doing this, which is now, my living, it really does feel like there was a kind of strange attractor that I didn't know what it was or why I was obsessed with it, but I was obsessed with it. And like
Isn't that weird?
I can
And how
think
it
back,
probably
yeah.
manifested in your life a long time ago, but in a different
Yes.
way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh man, what and this is almost exactly like what we were talking about with the woman who was told she was an emanation of something. It's like, and in the platonic sense, what we are as beings is we're we have some sort of divine faculty, they would, or I would call it divine faculty, but what they mean is that we have a share of logos essentially at the highest element of the psyche. And this is the part of the psyche that allows us to discern, that allows us to do things like mathematics and kind of peer into the deeper fabric of reality. But it's also the thing that has the capacity to commune with higher truths in a non rational way, in a way that is like, there, like I can like, like there's a curtain over here, like I can't see what's on the other side of the curtain, but I'm aware that something is there, and if I use all of my senses I can sort of like tell there's light coming through and stuff like that. And the more we get in touch with that part of ourselves, I think the more obsessed we become with the veneer of what's between us and the attractor on the other side or something. And when you tune yourself into that, it's like there's something I'm supposed to do, but I don't know what to do. But I'm sort of like a cartoon character following the, like, you know how they have like the visible scent, like the Pepe Le Pew is like the visible scent, and he's sort of like guided by the visible scent. It sort of just feels like that, and it manifests like, I think I want to do this thing. And
Yeah.
you start, and I don't know how it was for you, but for me it was like I was asking everyone for permission. Like, would you want to maybe start a podcast with me, or like do this thing with me? And then slowly you sort of figure out like, I need to do this, and it's not contingent on what anyone else thinks or feels or my parents' opinion. It's just what I feel like I have to do. And then you just fucking go for it. That's at least how it felt for me.
Well, the invisible scent, that's God. That's grace. And we get those whiffs, and it's always just probably barely enough or not enough. It's like a little hand in the fog. You're like, I think, oh man, it was right there. But it's just kind of little breadcrumbs to point you in a direction. And that's beautiful. You said something about seeing something out of the sides of your eyes in a way, or the periphery. And it just made me think that I have also heard traditions that say that's the only way to see the unseen or things of different dimensional places. Like if you look directly at it, it goes away.
Oh yeah, I believe that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And that often happens to me where I'll see something in my peripheral vision. I'll be like, wait, don't look at it.
yeah.
Try to just allow it. And I try to let it speak to me through like you can't put your finger on it. And I think that's also a kind of kryptonite to our modern world.
100%, man. It's like when you wake up, when you get jarred out of sleep, and you have all the crazy. I'm assuming you've seen the like fractal kind of like halo, the super psychedelic fractal halo that's like part of the dream realm or hypnagogic realm. But the second you try to fix your eyes on this like crazy whatever's going on in there, it just like dissipates, and then light comes into your pupils, and you start seeing, the box around you that is your room. But yeah, it feels very much like another layer of the exact same thing you just described, that there is so much going on in the unconscious, the other realm, the whatever you want to call it, that always evades direct perception. And this even goes back to the UFO conversation, man. It's just like the more you try to ascertain the thing with your senses, the more mercurial and mysterious and hidden it seems to become. But there's also something very, I don't know, there's part of me that likes that for some reason.
Yeah, it just shows that behind whatever boundary it is, it's cooler. Because if it turns out it was just a ship and there's a being inside, it's like, it's kind of lame.
Totally. Like, because think about
like,
it. What is the ultimate disappointment in every scary movie, every alien movie, every it's when they unveil the thing. 9 times out of 10, it's like, oh, this is what it is. This is fucking stupid.
Yeah, it's like, oh, how long was this journey for you? Oh man, that's kind of hard. Like, it's like I was hoping it was something more magical or some kind of ending of the suffering we have to go through.
Yeah.
Maybe it is, maybe it isn't.
Did you watch Lost back in the day?
Oh yeah, that's one of the only shows I watched, and I didn't have. I had to watch it like online, and it wasn't online, so it'd be like pirated. And I have to find some like episode. Okay, and it was always crap, but wasn't it on like ABC or something?
Yeah, it was.
I didn't have a TV, so I was like, but I got into the show because anything that started with like time travel, and like a guy punching numbers in a hole in the ground, is like, this is interesting.
It had like the most highbrow philosophical references, and there were characters named after favorite philosophers, and there was this mysterious force on this island that they were marooned on called the Dharma Initiative, and they were always making and like there was a character named Richard Alpert, and all of this kind of stuff, and like they're just playing with all these huge themes. And I don't think I minded the ending at the time, but it was universally sort of panned as like disappointing and overly like dramatic, and that's like a perfect example of what I'm talking about with the, like, when they unveil it, it's like the foreplay and the longing and the searching is almost more important than the thing that's unveiled.
Well, I
And
mean, look, for what it's worth, both myself and my girlfriend Rada, before we were together, turns out we both had semi-mystical experiences watching the last episode of Lost, which I find
nice.
I'm embarrassed to say it was
Don't
true.
be.
I don't know what it was. I was like just like wanting to finish a show. Before that, I just liked it. I watched the last episode. I remember I was up in the den of my parents' house because I was visiting. I was just like, I want to finish this show. And it got to the end, and I think there was some kind of like it was based. I don't even need to spoiler alert it for people. The point is, I just felt very emotional, and I felt like
Yeah.
kind of like weird release that I had. The
Yeah.
only times I'd felt that would be like on psychedelic journeys, where there was a kind of feeling, understanding that was really beautiful, but you couldn't say what it is, but you understood something. And I felt that with a TV show.
No, me
And I was
too.
like, what is going on? Is something encoded in this or embedded? And then I thought that was just me, and I was embarrassed. I kind of kept it to myself. And then years later, Rada and I are talking about it. She's like, oh, I love that show too. We were talking about it, and we somehow got to this conversation at the end. It's weird that you're even bringing it up. And she's like, I had the same response, you know?
Yeah.
Or conversely, there's been another show we were watching where she had like a panic attack. I have this random scene. And I'm like, so you wonder what's in these, it could be even the currents running unconsciously within the writers or some other mechanisms that are weaving into mass culture with certain things. That because like you said, when I had that experience of mine 15 years ago, I didn't understand what was going on. 100%, I couldn't tell you. I personally was like, oh, I have any authority over this, where I understand this, or I'm controlling this. I don't know. That was being graced by the mushrooms themselves or something else. And hopefully that's how this works with culture and art.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I've definitely had that feeling a lot of times, man, with music, with media of all different kinds, of feeling like there's some kind of transcendent, heart opening thing that makes you feel choked up, and like the heat is just rising up in your body, and like you want to cry and you also kind of want to laugh. It is like a pretty psychedelic feeling. And I definitely had that watching Lost back in the day. And yeah, I mean, again, spoiler alert, I guess, if this has now turned anyone on to wanting to watch the show, I'm going to pause and say what the kind of punchline of it is, at least from my memory. And the punchline is that most of, if not all, the characters had been dead basically the whole time.
The whole thing
And
is just purgatory.
yeah,
Essentially.
and there's like this kind of like coming home, coming back to the non-dual truth, to the light kind of moment. And yeah, it's like it is the most powerful archetype. Like, it's the thing that Jung said is the meta archetype of all archetypes, essentially, which is like that unity. The capital S self is the archetype of unity. It's the entire mandala, and realizing that you had the sense that you were traveling the mandala, but you were the whole mandala at the same
Right.
time. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Even when we just say it on paper, it's like, well, that doesn't seem very interesting narratively. It's like you can excuse anything just saying like, yeah, you're dead. And so all the stuff that happened, there you go. That's why. But for some reason in that moment, it had a kind of beauty. It was almost like the main character, Jack. I love that we're talking about this. It's like almost like it was for him in a way. And so all these souls conspiring to have someone come to a form of acceptance so they can let go. And I just think again, like Ram Dass, and when he was told his mother was a really high spiritual being, and he found that to be at first just incredulous, because he's like, my mother is definitely not a high spiritual being. In his mind is, so,
Who
but
said
when you
that?
try that on,
Did
and you're
did
like, go ahead.
I was just curious who said that to him. Do you know?
His teacher,
Oh,
Maharaji.
okay.
And so if you try that on, it's like, well, what if, my mother is sort of part of her incarnation, emanation, is to play a role so that I can be who I am too. And maybe that was like this huge gift from her as a soul, an entire lifetime where a big piece of it was to play a role. And then you just think about everyone and everything you ever come across and the web of connection.
Yeah.
And that we don't know how we're all serving each other in ways that could be so beautiful. So
Mhm.
beautiful. And we're so limited in the way we look at it from just like standing with our feet on the ground of like, well, I am this and you are that, and I want this and you want that, especially the people we're in conflict with.
Yeah.
Those the most.
Oh yeah, for sure, man. Yeah. I think I don't want to get pulled into a conversation about narratives because I don't think it's as fun as this other thread, which is on that note, I think there's both a incredibly nihilistic, limiting, dark extreme that you could take what you just said to. And that extreme is that you essentially have no free will and that you are just swimming in this sea of influences and you have the sense that you have some level of control, but it's all illusory. But the other way of looking at it is that we do live in some degree of a fatalistic reality, that these interconnections not only imply that there's more going on than what we see and that there could be these like this hierarchical kind of reality that we're participating in, but that we also are attached to certain things in a way that we don't understand, or certain outcomes or archetypal forces. And this is again the Western esoteric viewpoint, is that when you incarnate, you essentially go through all these archetypal thresholds and you take on all of these different archetypal forces. And this is what is, most popularly now known as like planetary archetypes. And obviously, everybody has an arrangement and a share and an apportionment of these traits. And to an extent, they're ruled by these personality traits. And this is just one very mild version of this. Also, the Platonic myth of which is amazing and something that everybody should read at some point because it gets into this whole reincarnation again, which is also another Western esoteric thing that we've lost. Is that basically all of the pre-Socratic, maybe not all, but a lot of the pre-Socratic philosophers, Pythagoras, for instance, believed in reincarnation. The Platonists believed in reincarnation. And when you incarnate, you do attach yourself essentially, like your soul is sort of attached to a fabric of fate. And this is where the myth of the three fates that weave the circumstance of the individual comes from, is that you have this pattern essentially attached to you at the moment of incarnation, and you unconsciously, to some degree, play that fade out, whether you're aware of it or not. But what is your sense of that sort of fate free will balance? Where do you fall in there?
You might not like this answer, but I think it's both. And I just feel like because even trying to put your foot in one of those camps feels like it's missing the point.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I really feel that we have a destiny, but it requires that we choose it. And that sort of koan is the answer, in that it can't be that we have no choice, but clearly there's deterministic factors. But fundamentally, I can admit that my worldview revolves around that we have a level of choice. And we've been speaking about it throughout this conversation. But it seems to be that is something that is beyond the boundary condition of our mind's understanding. And that's why it even almost rings more true. That's what koans are, in a sense.
Right.
Ways of tapping into those knowledge through breaking the gears or metaphor. That's what art is. That's what mystic poetry is about. So, yes, we have destiny, it seems, but in somehow our choice really matters.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what does that mean? I guess we can only translate down to say like your choices matter.
Yeah.
And in that way, there's a kind of liberation or empowerment to that, because they clearly seem to. But this is something like synchronicity where my heart tells me that it's true. And that heart knowing has more validity in the end than just my brain mind knowing.
Yeah.
And it's like knowing with a little K or a capital K. And we all know what that feels like, to just know something. And is that a choice? I think the doorway into that choice is your own choice. Like it's sort of a pre-existing ism that you have to step into or accept. A synchronicity is a small example of that. It can be something random or it can be something of meaning. Either way of interpreting it is correct, but you get to choose. And that, in essence, is the gift of living and the gift of the universe. We get to choose. And our choice is fundamental to the unfolding of our reality and our future. So if everyone, my friend Court says, all choices are valid and everyone graduates. It's kind of another way of saying it. Like we all return home, whether you like it or not. We're time rich, but you're going to choose your stuff around the way and you're going to go sideways and backwards, and that's fine. But eventually, it's almost like physics. Your choices are going to start to balance out where you're going to choose your way back.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually fully agree with you, man. Like the metaphor I like to use is this sort of open world. I'm sorry I'm telling this again, but the open world RPG metaphor. You know, if you play an open world RPG at the beginning of the game, you choose a class, right? If you decide to be a wizard, it's going to have a lot to say about your gameplay, your skill tree, what things are possible for you, what paths and like weapons you should not be using. Like don't be like, I'm going to use the biggest broadsword and my strength is a 1. You know, it's like clearly there's a path for this build, right? And you should follow that path. And I think that that's an oversimplified version of what my intuition and my cobbling together of all of this shit over the years kind of leads to is a sense of I don't have like ultimate control. Like I'm not in charge of this world. I'm not in charge of everything that happens, but I'm going through some kind of evolutionary process that's either trying to figure something out or express something or fulfill something through this disintegrating emanation that is Michael. And I can either go become full blown wizard master Michael, or I can sort of just become like one who gets distracted on side quests and like, yeah, he only made it to level 10. You know, he only made it to level 10 this time around. So next time we'll do this. And it feels like that. And again, this harmonizes with a lot of this Western esoteric shit. And for anybody who wants to know what I mean by that, read the Myth of Ur. It's all in there, and I think it's got unbelievable insight that maybe isn't the type of language we would use today, but I think it completely maps on to what both you and I are saying in this example.
Yeah, and you get to choose. You know, I mean, that's the whole idea that the judgment is really coming from ourselves, which we can probably identify that within the context of what it is like in our interior landscape, the amount of judgment we all have internally. But to think that from a soul point of view, you're making these decisions, there's no sort of punishment. You are just navigating through the levels of choices of what might be the most beneficial for you, perhaps.
Yeah, I don't know if there's punishment or a
I don't
reward,
know.
or I hope there's not. I hope we live in a very forgiving situation, and I hope that we're not just mentally fapping into a nihilistic universe with wishful thinking or something too.
Well, I think there's
That's
a lot
another
of
thing I
brave
wish.
souls out there, and I just encourage people to lean into that bravery as opposed to the nihilism or
Yes.
the. It does take a lot of bravery to be alive today, and so stepping into whatever your path is, it's important.
What is that? And we can finish up on this riff, but what is stepping? It sounds cliche for me to even say it this way, but what does stepping into that bravery look like? Do you think in a practical sense? Like
Well,
what?
it's
Yeah.
different for everybody. I mean, that is sort of the point: is that there's no singular path. But I would venture to guess that for all of us, it's the things closest to us.
Hmm.
And that's usually the things we look at last. So it would be your relationships would be one of the biggest crucibles for our work. That might be if you don't have a partner or family that you feel like that makes sense for you. It may be a pet. It may even be yourself. Um, it's it's actually simpler things as opposed to any kind of grand gestures. In the documentary we're working on, Duncan Trussell talks about this at the end, and it's in a bit of the song that we did So What, where I was sampling him from the podcast convo about returning to your therapist, getting back on that meditation cushion tomorrow one more time. Or for me, it's often about like with music and my relationships. But we're told that inner work doesn't matter. In the broad strokes, it's like, yeah, it's frivolous. It's like there's things going on in the world. You got to get out there and deal with it, or we need to vote for the next president. I'm not saying those things aren't true. I'm just saying that change happens from the inside out. And so that inner work is not only important, it's critical. And I see personally the situation we find ourselves in as a spiritual crisis because we're all kind of like not knowing quite what we stand on, and our authority systems are breaking down and we don't feel that inner authority. But no one can give that to you. You choose that too. And it's not a big mystery. It's what are the practices that help you fall into realizing what you already have in the work that you have in front of you. It's I mean, if you are in any sort of relationships, that's probably ground zero for the most like potent work that you can do that have the biggest effect on your inner state and your evolution as a being and your bravery. But just waking up and going through any practice, even if it's 30 seconds of taking like 7 breaths in and out, man, is that honorable these days, because even that is hard to like weirdly make time for yourself to do things that actually feel good after you do them. But that is stepping forward with a kind of resilience and bravery to say, I'm aiming for clarity. Like I'm aiming for some kind of like truth and not just reactiveness. And that is an act of courage today because there's so much coming at us. And I think it's important.
Well said, brother. Couldn't agree more. Thanks for doing this again. Really excited to see your documentary too. When is it going to be like available?
It's coming out in the fall. In September 2024 is the current plan. So maybe we can circle back and talk around then. There'll be lots of things and events, and I can send you a pre-screening link. We're finishing up now, and we've been getting some great responses from the pre-screenings we've been doing. So, but musicformushrooms.com, if you want to just sign up to get updates down the road here in the year, there'll be a more fleshed out website.
Yeah, let's absolutely do it. Can't wait to see it. And I always look forward to continuing the riffs.
Thanks, brother.